Nicolas Maduro was in his bedroom when Delta Force came through the door. Not a bunker, not a diplomatic safe room, not an armored convoy evacuating through prearranged escape routes that every head of state operating under a threat environment maintains as a survival protocol. His bedroom, in his own presidential compound, in his own capital city, surrounded by his own military, his own intelligence services, his own presidential security detail, and the entire institutional apparatus of a government he had been running through political violence and narco-state economics for years. F-35 strikes had already neutralized Venezuelan air defenses before the helicopter crossed the threshold of Caracas airspace. The helicopter came in low at 2 a.m. local time. The compound's perimeter was addressed. The door of the bedroom was not a meaningful obstacle to what came through it. Nicolas Maduro and his wife were on a plane out of Venezuelan airspace within hours. By the following afternoon, he was on American soil at Stewart International Airport in New York, charged with narco-terrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons offenses. The most well-protected dictator in the Western Hemisphere, extracted from his own bedroom by American operators who flew into Venezuelan airspace in aircraft Venezuela could not detect, disabled Venezuela's air defenses before the ground element moved, and were gone before the Venezuelan military's command structure could produce a coherent response. This extraction traces to a specific number, 23. 23 things went wrong on the night of April 24th, 1980, in the Iranian desert, at a salt flat 200 miles southeast of Tehran. The commission that Admiral James Holloway III had convened identified every single one of them, documented 11 as major in the sense that they had directly affected the catastrophic outcome, and produced the report that created from those 23 failures the institutional architecture that put Delta Force in Nicolas Maduro's bedroom in Caracas, and 2 rounds into Osama bin Laden's head in Abbottabad, and pulled Saddam Hussein out of a 6-foot spider hole near Tikrit, and put the 70-pound Belgian Malinois named Cairo in a custom Kevlar vest with night vision goggles in a stealth-modified Black Hawk helicopter, flying 150 miles into Pakistani airspace undetected. 23 failures. One report. 46 years later, the machine those failures created is positioned in the Indian Ocean aboard the MV Ocean Trader with Tier 1 operators and helicopter assets, prepared for the Isfahan uranium mission that is the current operational expression of everything those 23 failures ultimately produced. This is the story of how America built the most lethal special operations force in human history by studying its most catastrophic failure with the specific ruthlessness that institutional survival demands. The failure began in 1979. The Shah of Iran, who had been America's principal regional partner for 30 years, was overthrown in a religious revolution that brought Ayatollah Khomeini back from exile in Paris to declare Iran an Islamic republic and America the Great Satan. The Shah was dying of cancer. He asked if he could come to the United States for medical treatment. President Carter said yes. 13 days after the Shah arrived in New York, approximately 3,000 Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They overwhelmed the Marine Guards, who followed their orders and did not open fire, because embassy guards are specifically prohibited from using lethal force unless lives are in immediate danger, precisely to prevent a diplomatic incident from escalating into a war. 66 Americans were taken hostage. The original plan, as the students later acknowledged, was a symbolic 48 to 72-hour sit-in. Their stated demand was the Shah's return to face trial. Within 24 hours, Khomeini went on Iranian state radio and endorsed the takeover publicly, calling it the Second Revolution. Carter refused to surrender a dying ally to a revolutionary tribunal that would have executed him. 444 days. That is how long the hostages were held. During those 444 days, ABC created a nightly broadcast counting the days that eventually became Nightline and ran for 25 years. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees in every American city. The images of American diplomats blindfolded, beaten, paraded for cameras with signs around their necks, subjected to mock executions, where captors cocked rifles and announced this was the end before laughing and walking them back to their cells, ran on every broadcast in every country every single night. Carter was dying politically. The country was furious. After 5 months of failed diplomacy, failed UN mediation, failed Algerian mediation, failed Vatican mediation, every back channel collapsed because the one demand Iran would not drop was the one America could not meet. Carter walked into a room with his top military advisors and said they were going to go get them. The problem was that America in 1980 had no capacity for what he was describing. The United States military in 1980 operated as 4 completely separate and openly rival institutions: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. They used different radios that could not communicate with each other, different encryption systems, different chains of command, different doctrines, different definitions of basic terminology. They trained separately, planned separately, and actively despised each other. The Air Force was quietly trying to eliminate its special operations aircraft from the budget because it did not believe they were worth the allocation. The Navy considered the Marines glorified ship security. The Army thought everyone else was useless. There was no Joint Special Operations Command. No Special Operations Command of any kind. No agreed-upon doctrine for how the four branches were supposed to function on a single mission. And yet, the mission Carter signed off on required all four operating in coordinated joint action, plus the CIA, plus a unit that had been fully operational for approximately 5 months. Delta Force had been founded in November 1977 by Colonel Charlie Beckwith, a Vietnam veteran who had spent a year embedded with the British SAS in the 1960s and returned to America certain that the U.S. military needed a small, surgically precise counterterrorism unit that could deploy anywhere on short notice. The Pentagon said no for over a decade. Beckwith wrote papers, briefed generals, testified before Congress. He finally got approval to stand up the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta in November 1977. These men had never run a real-world mission. Their first would be the most complicated hostage rescue in modern military history, 6,000 miles from home, into a country where the United States had functionally zero intelligence assets on the ground. The CIA's intelligence capacity in Iran had been systematically dismantled. Carter had appointed Admiral Stansfield Turner as Director of Central Intelligence in 1977. Turner fired or forced out over 800 officers from the Directorate of Operations, the actual spies. The covert network built across 30 years was dismantled in 18 months. When the embassy was taken in November 1979, America could not see inside Iran. Planning a rescue operation without ground intelligence meant planning around uncertainty. The hostages might be in any of 6 buildings inside the compound. Clearing all 6 required more operators. More operators required more helicopters. More helicopters required more fuel. More fuel required more logistics. Every additional requirement generated 3 more. What had been designed as a surgical snatch and grab became a 2-night multi-stage monster involving over 130 operators, 8 helicopters, 6 C-130 transport aircraft, 2 airfields, 2 safe houses, AC-130 gunships, Army Rangers, CIA paramilitary, and a carrier in the Arabian Sea. Operation Eagle Claw. Carter gave it the green light on April 16, 1980. At roughly 3 a.m. Iranian time on April 24th, 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters lifted off from the USS Nimitz's deck and turned north toward Iran. One immediately got a warning light for a cracked rotor blade and had to abort, down to 7. Then the 7 remaining helicopters flew directly into a haboob. A haboob is an Arabic word for a wall of sand the size of a city, not a dust cloud. A 1,000-foot-tall, 50-mile-wide rolling wall of fine particulate matter that gets into engines, instruments, radios, eyes, and everything else. The pilots had been briefed on possible dust. Nobody briefed them on a biblical sandstorm. Visibility went to 0 instantly. Helicopters separated. 2 fought through on instruments and prayer. A third turned around entirely and flew back to the Nimitz because the pilot believed his instruments were failing. They were failing because the haboob was clogging the cooling vents on the avionics. 6 was the predetermined mission minimum. 5 or fewer, automatic abort. After 2 hours fighting God's own sandstorm, 6 helicopters limped into Desert 1 90 minutes behind schedule. The C-130s were there. Refueling began. For one moment it looked salvageable. Then Helicopter 6 developed a hydraulic failure in its second-stage flight control system that could not be repaired in the field. Mission dead. 5 helicopters. Abort. But Desert 1 was sitting next to a public road, in the middle of a salt flat, at night. And as the abort order was processing, a civilian Iranian bus came down that road with 45 passengers. Rangers stopped it with a warning shot, detained everyone aboard in a C-130. Minutes later, a fuel tanker came down the same road. The driver was smuggling gasoline, which was entirely predictable, given that post-revolution Iran was rationing fuel so aggressively that desert black market gasoline runs were among the most common nocturnal activities in rural Iran. The driver saw armed soldiers, hit the gas, tried to drive through the roadblock. A Delta Force intelligence officer named Wade Ishimoto ordered his man to take the truck out with an anti-tank weapon. The disposable rocket hit the tanker dead center. The truck became a fireball visible for miles in every direction. The driver somehow bailed out before the explosion, sprinted, jumped into a following pickup, and drove off into the darkness. The passenger was killed instantly. Ishimoto's documented statement afterward: "Holy mackerel, a fuel truck." America now had a dead Iranian civilian, 2 escaped witnesses driving toward civilization, a salt flat burning visibly for miles, and 45 detained passengers in a C-130 cargo bay. Beckwith reportedly told an officer, "Welcome to World War III." The abort order came from Washington. Pack up, evacuate. Get out before the Iranian military arrives. Getting the C-130s airborne required repositioning 1 helicopter, Bluebeard 3, piloted by Marine Major Jim Schaefer. The Salt Flat surface had been hard-packed and clean when the CIA's Twin Otter did the reconnaissance run 3 weeks earlier. The same sandstorms that produced the Haboob had blown a thick layer of fine, ankle-deep dust across the entire surface in the intervening weeks. Ground taxiing was impossible in the dust. Schaefer had to hover taxi. The moment Bluebeard 3 lifted, the rotor wash created a brownout, a swirling cloud of dust so thick the pilot could see nothing outside the cockpit. His only visual reference was an Air Force combat controller standing in front of the helicopter signaling directions. When Schaefer lifted into the hover, the rotor wash blasted the controller backwards. Schaefer, watching his only reference point appear to move away, interpreted it as his helicopter drifting backward. He applied forward stick. The controller, sand in his eyes, kept staggering back. Schaefer kept correcting forward. Bluebeard 3's main rotor blade clipped the vertical stabilizer of the EC-130 directly behind it. The helicopter pitched forward and crashed into the wing root of a C-130 that had been carrying collapsible rubber fuel bladders holding thousands of gallons of helicopter fuel inside its cargo bay. The aircraft became a bomb. Both went up in a single fireball, violent enough to physically rock the other C-130s parked nearby. 5 Air Force airmen died instantly. Major Richard Baca, Major Harold Lewis, Major Lynn McIntosh, Captain Charles McMillan, Technical Sergeant Joel Mayo. 3 Marines aboard Bluebeard 3 were also killed. Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson, Sergeant John Harvey. Corporal George Holmes Jr. Schaefer and his co-pilot dove from the cockpit and survived with serious burns. The ordnance inside the burning C-130 began cooking off. Tracer rounds fired in every direction from the fireball. A red-eye missile launched itself from the burning fuselage and flew off into the desert. Anyone still on the Salt Flat was sprinting for the surviving aircraft while live ammunition detonated behind them. They left behind 5 fully intact RH-53D helicopters they could not destroy. 8 dead Americans whose bodies could not be recovered. And inside the abandoned helicopters, classified mission documents, photographs of the embassy compound, the names of CIA agents operating undercover in Tehran. The Iranians arrived at sunrise. They paraded the bodies on state television. Khomeini gave a speech declaring God had sent angels in the form of the Haboob to protect Iran from the great Satan. The hostages were immediately scattered across the country in groups small enough to make any second rescue attempt mathematically impossible. The CIA assets whose names were published eventually faced the specific consequences of exposure that the intelligence community's worst nightmare involves. Carter went on television on April 25th and admitted the entire operation to the American people. The hostages did not come home for 9 more months. They walked off a plane in Algiers on January 20th, 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th president. Carter flew to Germany to personally greet them. He later wrote that losing the rescue mission was the single biggest factor in losing the 1980 election. The world watched Desert One. Enemies laughed, allies winced. The Soviet Union spent weeks rubbing it in on every available diplomatic channel. The Iranians treated it as divine confirmation. The Pentagon was furious in the specific way that institutional failure at catastrophic scale produces fury that bypasses grief and goes directly to architectural resolution. The Joint Chiefs convened the Holloway Commission. Admiral James Holloway III, retired 4-star, former Chief of Naval Operations, 30 years of combat experience, no political career left to protect, no service rivalry left to defend. His job, figure out every single thing that went wrong and figure out how none of it ever happens again. The Holloway Report, released in August 1980, identified 23 specific issues, 11 flagged as major. Some were tactical, weather forecasting that missed the Haboob, hydraulic systems that should have been flagged weeks earlier, communication procedures insufficiently rehearsed. These were fixable through better planning. The larger findings were structural. The 4 services could not talk to each other on the radio because their equipment used incompatible frequencies and encryption systems, different chains of command, different operational doctrines, different abort criteria, different definitions of fundamental terminology, different not in the intellectually rich way that diversity produces innovation, but in the institutionally catastrophic way that means soldiers whose lives depend on each other cannot coordinate during the specific seconds when coordination determines whether everyone comes home. The Marine pilots flying the RH-53Ds had been pulled from a regular Navy fleet squadron whose standard mission was shipboard mine countermeasures. They had minimal experience with the long-range, low-altitude overland flight profile Eagle Claw demanded, and essentially no experience operating in desert conditions at all. The mission had been planned by an ad hoc joint task force assembled from scratch in a Pentagon basement with no permanent staff, no dedicated budget, no institutional memory, and a mandate that would dissolve the moment the mission ended regardless of outcome. There was no single commander with authority over all 4 services. There was no permanent organization anywhere in the United States military whose job was to plan, train for, or execute this kind of operation. Holloway's language for this was diplomatically restrained and operationally damning, a self-imposed disability. The enemy did not defeat the United States at Desert One. The United States military's own institutional structure defeated it. From that specific self-awareness, delivered in a report that landed on every senior desk in Washington with the authority of a concluded autopsy, the transformation began. In December 1980, the Pentagon created the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, headquartered at Pope Field adjacent to Fort Bragg. Its entire mandate: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Special Operations Forces would train together, live together, and function as a single coherent fighting force when the next crisis arrived. Delta Force was placed directly under JSOC's command. The Navy produced its counterpart within 2 months. In November 1980, SEAL Officer Richard Marcinko was tasked by the Chief of Naval Operations to build a dedicated counterterrorism SEAL unit from scratch. He named it SEAL Team 6. The name was a deliberate deception. The U.S. Navy had only 2 SEAL teams at the time. Marcinko named his unit 6 specifically to make Soviet intelligence believe America had 3 other SEAL teams it knew nothing about. SEAL Team 6 was placed under JSOC and became its maritime counterterrorism element. 30 years later, SEAL Team 6 put 2 rounds into Osama bin Laden's head in a 3rd-floor bedroom in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The air component followed in October 1981 when the Army activated the 160th Aviation Battalion at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The Night Stalkers. Created for a specific reason that Desert One had made impossible to ignore. Special Operations could not keep borrowing fleet pilots trained for completely different missions. They needed pilots who flew nothing else, trained for nothing else, and answered to the Special Operations community exclusively. The 160th standard for hitting a target, plus or minus 30 seconds of planned time. Not plus or minus a few minutes, 30 seconds, at night, in hostile territory, at low altitude in helicopters, modified specifically for the acoustic and electromagnetic signature reduction that undetected penetration of denied airspace requires. The institutional architecture was now in place, but the Pentagon's bureaucratic structure, the 4 services still competing for budget, still maintaining separate promotion tracks, still operating as rival corporations, was slow enough that it continued producing the same inter-service coordination failures that Desert One had exposed. October 1983, Grenada, Operation Urgent Fury. A Marxist coup endangered approximately 1,000 American medical students. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine helicopter pilots, and Air Force Special Tactics teams all converged on the same Caribbean island with incompatible radios and divided chains of command. The documented story of an American soldier on Grenada having to use a payphone and a personal credit card to call Fort Bragg from the battlefield because his radio could not reach the Air Force jets directly overhead is the specific proof that the institutional problem the Holloway report identified was still present 3 years later. The training and command innovations having addressed the special operations level without reaching the Pentagon's governing structure. People died in Grenada who should not have died. Congress snapped. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of October 1986 is, without exaggeration, the single most important piece of military legislation in modern American history. It rewired the Department of Defense from its institutional foundations. It forced the 4 services to operate jointly by making joint duty assignment a prerequisite for general and admiral rank. It made the chairman of the Joint Chiefs the principal military advisor to the president, rather than the first among equals in an institutional rivalry. It created a single clean chain of command running from the president to the combatant commander to the operator on the objective. It ended, by force of law, the 4 services as rival corporations model that had killed 8 Americans in the Iranian desert 6 years earlier. The Nunn-Cohen Amendment in 1987 completed the architecture. Senators Sam Nunn and William Cohen pushed through the creation of United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, a 4-star unified command at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. All Tier 1 special operations in every service under one roof, one budget, one command. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the 75th Rangers, the Green Berets, Air Force Special Tactics, the 160th SOAR. SOCOM was activated on April the 16th, 1987, almost exactly 7 years after Desert One went up in flames. For the next decade, the machine trained and waited. The Cold War ended. The Gulf War came and went. Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo. SOCOM was present for all of them, building the muscle memory and refining the doctrine that the specific catastrophic mission it would one day be handed required. September 11th gave the machine its mandate and its blank check simultaneously. What followed started with 12-man Green Beret teams from the 5th Special Forces Group, riding Afghan horses borrowed from local warlords into combat because the terrain was too rough for vehicles, calling in B-52 strikes from the saddle, toppling the Taliban government in approximately 2 months with a total ground force of 400 to 500 American operators. The horse soldiers. A 16-foot bronze statue of one of them stands at Ground Zero in New York today. The machine hunted Saddam Hussein for 9 months across Iraq, working the interrogation loop of captured documents and inner circle sources, and on December 13, 2003, pulled him from a 6-foot spider hole at a mud-walled farmhouse near Tikrit. The tyrant, who had used chemical weapons against his own people, invaded his neighbors, threatened the region for 40 years, was found hiding underground in a hole while soldiers in beards and Oakleys documented the moment. Between 2003 and 2010, the machine dismantled al-Qaeda in Iraq through a campaign of nightly direct action that the organization's own captured documents later described as a war of extermination they could not win. General Stanley McChrystal at JSOC invented modern industrial-scale counterterrorism. Intelligence, surveillance, and direct action as one closed loop. Every raid generated the intelligence for the next raid. At peak tempo, JSOC ran 3 or 4 raids a night, every single night, for years. And then Abbottabad. The CIA spent nearly a decade hunting Osama bin Laden. By 2010, they had narrowed his location to a fortified compound in a residential city 35 miles north of Islamabad, adjacent to Pakistan's primary military academy. 12 to 18-foot walls topped with barbed wire. No internet, no phone lines. Residents burned their trash. 24 people living inside. The CIA built its picture from a rented safe house down the road for months and never got a confirmed photograph of bin Laden himself. They made the call on circumstantial evidence and educated inference. Obama signed off on the raid in late April 2011. 2 stealth-modified MH-60 Blackhawks from the 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers built from the specific lessons of the Marine pilots who had no overland desert flight experience at Desert One, flew 25 SEALs from SEAL Team 6 and 1 Belgian Malinois named Cairo across 150 miles of Pakistani airspace at low altitude hugging terrain in the middle of the night. 2 MH-47 Chinooks followed as backup. Cairo wore a custom Kevlar vest and night vision goggles and sat between his handler's legs in the second helicopter. His job was perimeter security and tunnel detection. The flight took 90 minutes. Pakistan's radar network never detected them. SEALs in Cairo roped down. The assault element blew through metal gates, addressed threats on the ground floor and staircase, and found a tall, thin, gray-bearded man on the 3rd floor in his own bedroom, with one of his wives between him and the Navy SEALs. 2 rounds, once in the chest, once above the left eye. Bin Laden's body was at sea from the deck of the USS Carl Vinson within 24 hours. SEAL Team 6 was back in Jalalabad before the sun came up. The only name publicly released from the operation, Cairo's. The dog got a personal congratulation from the Commander-in-Chief at Fort Campbell 4 days later. Now, May 2026, the same machine's current operational expression. The MV Ocean Trader is positioned in the Indian Ocean off Diego Garcia with Tier 1 operators and helicopter assets. Those operators are the institutional descendants of Charlie Beckwith's original Delta Force, which had been fully operational for 5 months when Eagle Claw launched, and which has since run hundreds of real-world missions, whose publicly known highlights include Saddam Hussein from a spider hole, bin Laden from a 3rd-floor bedroom, and Nicolas Maduro from his bedroom in Caracas at 2 a.m. with F-35 strikes, clearing Venezuelan air defenses before the ground element crossed the threshold. The Isfahan uranium facility, 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Space Force surveillance, at the resolution to identify individuals by name and badge number, the Supreme Leader's order that the uranium stays in Iran, Trump's commitment to Israel that the uranium leaves under any deal, the MOU's concurrent sequencing of uranium transfer and sanctions easing, the IAEA verification architecture, the 9 world leaders who said we are in simultaneously. The deal's announcement on Memorial Day weekend exists in the specific operational context of the machine that Eagle Claw built. The machine is what gives the deal its enforcement architecture. The deal's implementation requires the IRGC's institutional compliance. The IRGC's institutional compliance is influenced by the specific knowledge that the machine that extracted Maduro from his bedroom in Caracas is positioned in the Indian Ocean with Tier 1 operators and helicopter assets, and is being directed by a command structure whose existence traces directly to the 23 failures that Admiral Holloway documented in August 1980. 8 Americans died in an Iranian sandstorm in 1980. Their names deserve to be said. Major Richard Baca, Major Harold Lewis, Major Lynn McIntosh, Captain Charles McMillan, Technical Sergeant Joel Mayo, Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson, Sergeant John Harvey, Corporal George Holmes Jr. The machine built from their deaths extracted Nicolas Maduro from his bedroom. The machine built from their deaths put 2 rounds into Osama bin Laden's head. The machine built from their deaths pulled Saddam Hussein from a hole in the ground. And the machine built from their deaths is positioned in the Indian Ocean right now, in the specific operational context of the deal that the petroleum engineering clock and the naval blockade and the Chinese defection from Iranian economic support produced. prepared for the Isfahan mission that represents the current iteration of every mission the machine has executed since the Holloway Report created the institutional architecture to make those missions possible. The Goldwater-Nichols Joint Command Structure, JSOC's Unified Special Operations Mandate, SEAL Team 6's maritime counterterrorism element named 6 as a deception. The Night Stalker's 30-second precision standard born from the specific lesson of Marine pilots who had no overland desert experience flying RH-53Ds into Iran. The Link 16 data network that connects every platform in the operational area. The F-35's stealth penetration that cleared Venezuelan air defenses before Maduro's bedroom door was addressed. All of it traces to one bad night in an Iranian desert. Iran accidentally built the instrument of its own current, most critical vulnerability. The specific humiliation that forced America to construct the most lethal special operations command in human history. Maduro's bedroom was addressed at 2 a.m. The uranium is leaving Iran, and Wade Ishimoto's holy mackerel, a fuel truck, is the specific origin point of the operational capability that makes both of those sentences true.